Have you ever wondered, what if the Nazis had won World War II? What if the outcome of a decisive battle or battles was different? One where the Allies came out second best? What if decisions were made differently? What if? That's what we're going to find out on tonight's episode. Good evening, you're listening to The Truth Tank and I'm your host, The Tank. If this is your first time listening to The Truth Tank, a big welcome. If you're a repeat listener, welcome back. By now, you should know that the Live Communism Chapters 1 and 2 are available now wherever you get your podcasts from. Chapter 3 is in the works and should be out pretty soon. If you're enjoying the Live Communism, why not leave it a 5-star rating and review and help it get noticed by the pod algorithms. So, tonight's episode is going to be a very interesting one. It's going to be on the Hitler options. I first came across this book in my travels about 3 or 4 years ago. I was in a secondhand bookshop. I was just browsing through the military and history section as I commonly do in a bookshop. I got about 5 to 7 books. A few of the books in the military history section I'd heard of before, like Dunkirk, Black Hawk Down, Generation Kill, and a couple of other titles like that. Some I had, some I hadn't. But on the top shelf of this section, I saw this book sticking out. It had a very intriguing title, cool cover art. It was calling out to me and stuck out like a neon sign in a dark alley somewhere. I picked it up, gave it the once over. Thought, yeah, this looks interesting, but it's a bit hypothetical, not quite what I was into at the time. I wanted more historical, factual based books, but I thought it was intriguing nonetheless. So I went to the counter, paid for my 5 to 7 books I brought, went home and couldn't stop thinking about this book that I had seen. The book that had reached out from all the other ones and was saying, buy me, I'm only $3.50, but I didn't buy it. But I kept thinking about it day after day, and about 2 weeks later I went back to the same secondhand bookshop and bought it with a couple of other books. I actually found some really good books the second time I went in. One was The Stargate Conspiracy, and the other one was In the Heart of the Ocean, In the Heart of the Sea, that Chris Hemsworth movie. But this is the book that the movie was based on, about the real life killer whale, the inspiration for Moby Dick. So this time around, I got the book, paid for it, went home, gave it a quick once-over, and thought this would make a really good podcast, or a series of podcasts. Even though it's hypothetical, it is grounded in reality and fact. And it's presented really interestingly. All the authors in the book are either military historians or have served in the military in various capacities, such as colonels and majors and things like that. So these are experts in the field giving their 2 cents about what might have happened if the Nazis had won certain battles, or if things had have turned out differently. I thought that was a really cool concept. It could make a really interesting TV series or a movie. And I thought this book would make a fantastic podcast series, and to my knowledge, I don't think anyone else has looked into it, or looked into it too much, which is a shame because I think it is a very interesting insight into what might have been. The book presents us with a what-if scenario, an alternative outcome to key battles in World War II. In other words, what if the Nazis had won decisive victories in battles? So not quite the man in the high castle scenario where the Nazis win World War II and take over the world. It's more focused on a what-if alternative scenario for key battles. The book's full title is The Hitler Options, Alternative Decisions of World War II. It's edited by Kenneth Macksey. The copy I'll be referencing and referring to is the first edition published in 2000 by Wren Publishing. The book has 10 chapters. Each chapter covers a decisive battle of World War II and is written by a different expert in the field, whether that be a historian or someone who has served in the armed forces in some capacity, such as a general or a colonel. There's some pretty well-known decisive battles in it. Kenneth Macksey kicks it off with Operation Sea Lion. I think the concept for the book is very interesting. It's unusual too, because a lot of, I'd say probably a majority of books on World War II just focus on the facts and outcomes. And I'm pretty sure there's been more books written about World War II than any other subject in history, apart from maybe the American Civil War and obviously the Bible. It got my attention. I'm always thinking about, what if this had turned out like that? What if this group beat this group? What if history didn't turn out the way we know it to? What if the Persians invaded Greece and won? The Western world would be completely different. What happens if the height of Egypt was actually later in history? What happened if the Sultan took over Eastern Europe? What if the Vikings didn't invade Britain and other parts of Europe? What if they took over completely? What if Neanderthals didn't die out? What if they survived and moved to the southern hemisphere? A lot of experts like to shoot down that theory, but there's been a bit of evidence to suggest that maybe they did. What if is a very interesting line of questioning. As I said, it definitely got my attention, and I thought it'd make a really interesting podcast series, and will hopefully bring some attention back to this book. I haven't seen it since I found it in the secondhand bookshop all those years ago. Either way, I think it deserves a bit more recognition, and it provides a very interesting hypothetical scenario based on facts and backed up by experts. So the editor of the book and contributor to Chapter 1, Kenneth Macksey, served in the Royal Tank Regiment from 1941 to 1967, so it stands to reason he actually knows what he's talking about when it comes to military tactics. He's also a military historian of international recognition and has written over 40 books, a majority of them on World War II. Some of the books he has written include The German Invasion of England, July 1940, Guardian Panzer General, and the Penguin Encyclopedia of Modern War, which I'm pretty sure I have somewhere and have referenced before over the years. It's pretty safe to say we're in good hands. Mr. Macksey knows what he's talking about, which eliminates a lot of doubt, because if this was just some fucking college kid writing this book, it wouldn't be taken as quite as seriously. But all these guys are experts in their field, and a lot of thought and time has been put into these scenarios. A lot of facts have been weighed up. So this episode, as I mentioned before, will look at Operation Sea Lion. Operation Sea Lion was a Nazi code name given to the planned invasion of the southern coast of the UK. It was to take place 9 months after World War II had started, during the Battle of Britain in 1940. After the Battle of France, Adolf Hitler had hoped the Nazi push through the country would be enough to deter the British from an all-out war with Germany. Unfortunately for Hitler, he underestimates the British sense of resolve and the fact that Germany wasn't the first military to threaten the people of Britain. If you know anything about history, Britain has been attacked various times over the course of the past 1,000 or so years, probably even going back further than that. The Romans have had a go, the Vikings have had a go, the Germans have had a go. Britain is a very resilient country that is used to being attacked and has always been invaded by someone or threatened to some capacity. And the old saying, stiff upper lip, definitely applies. That old saying, stiff upper lip, definitely comes from somewhere. And that isn't attributed to the British people for no good reason. I feel like I have to mention this because it seems like a large amount of the global population has lost its mind and all sense of logic. This episode is going to mention the word Nazi and Hitler a lot. The book is obviously called The Hitler Options, and you can't really talk about World War II without mentioning the Nazis. So if you are a woke wanker who is offended by words such as that, listen to a different podcast. This episode is not condoning Hitler, the Nazis. It's not glorifying them in any way, shape or form. I despise Hitler. He's an interesting historical figure, that is for sure. But he was a fucking lunatic and completely insane and caused a hell of a lot of pain and suffering on a scale not seen for a very long time. It's kind of hard to have an episode about World War II if you don't mention the key players. And if you are sensitive, please listen to another podcast. But I am in no way, shape or form a fan of Adolf Hitler or the Nazis, and that's what we're going to be looking at on tonight's episode. So without further ado, let's get into tonight's show. This is episode 89 of the Truth Tank, The Hitler Options, Operation Sea Lion, by Kenneth Macksey. After Hitler's push through France, he proposes terms to the British government he had hoped they would accept, and that an invasion of the southern coastline would be a last resort if the British people didn't accept his offer. So Hitler is really going out on a limb here. He, I think, is a little overconfident. He has basically steamrolled through France. He's caught the British and the French off guard, and is definitely making these proposals from a place of confidence. He definitely felt confident given the disaster of Dunkirk that had happened before and the troops and the equipment that had been left behind on the beaches of France. It was definitely a very big blow to the British, not just in terms of military logistics and strategy, but it was a blow to the British ego and to the nation as a whole. And Hitler probably felt pretty confident that his proposal would work, given he would have thought Germany had the upper hand, definitely after Dunkirk and the occupation of parts of France and indeed its capital, Paris. He would have been more than confident that his proposal was going to work and was probably sitting back somewhere in Paris just waiting for some type of communication from the British government telling him that they had accepted his proposal. Now, is this arrogance, or is it because the speed the German army did push through France? I think the events of Dunkirk, more than anything, probably give the Germans and Hitler a false sense of security and confidence. It definitely caught the British and the French off guard. They were very caught up with the evacuation and trying to get as many men off the beach as possible. From Hitler's point of view, it's probably a great time to submit a proposal. The British government is more than likely probably going to go along with it if it means they can get their troops off of the beach, because there was a hell of a lot of men stranded on those beaches. It was a fair chunk of the British army. England would have been pretty defenceless if all of them had been captured or killed. It would have been a disastrous blow to the British army. Unfortunately, things don't turn out like that. 338,000 men were saved. Around 67,774 were killed, wounded or captured during the battle. A lot of troops were taken prisoner. Around 68,111 British and around 40,000 French troops were taken prisoner by the Germans, which in itself is a huge fucking number. 68,000 is a sizable portion of any army. A large majority of the army was saved, but that's still a hell of a lot of troops to be taken prisoner. Those figures are from forceswarrecords.com. So the Germans, on the other hand, lose about 20,000 troops. That in itself is still a large number. Not as high as the British or French, but 20,000 is still a sizable figure. And that's not to mention the losses in equipment, ships and vehicles. That was all very expensive stuff that at the time wasn't very easy to replace. Especially the ships and equipment. A lot of weapons were left on the beaches as well. Even though you had a bulk of the army being saved, an army can't fight without weapons or equipment. In terms of equipment losses, they were much higher than the personnel losses. And according to Google, the British Expeditionary Force lost pretty much all of its heavy equipment, which included a large amount of artillery, tanks, and vehicles. Around 20,000 motorcycles were lost, 2,472 guns, and around 64,000 trucks. And that is a hell of a lot of equipment to lose. So it's no wonder that Hitler felt pretty confident the British government was just going to bend the knee to his proposal. And digging a little deeper than that, vehicles and motorbikes are a huge loss, but in terms of defending the country, tanks and artillery and ammunition is probably what really counts. So all up, the British Expeditionary Force lost around 184 cruiser tanks, 77 Matilda tanks, 331 Mark 6 light tanks, and 23 Matilda II tanks. Artillery losses were just as high. The Expeditionary Force lost 704 18 to 25 pound guns, 216 18 pounder guns, 96 4.5 inch howitzers, 221 6-inch howitzers, 51 4.5 inch 60 pound guns, and a number of heavy and super heavy railway guns. They also lost 509 2-pounder anti-tank guns, as well as small arms such as firearms, rifles, mortars, and weapons of that nature. Leaving the equipment behind is one thing. The guns and the artillery are not much good without the ammunition for them to fire. Hundreds of tons of ammunition was left behind on the beaches as well, along with 165,000 tons of petrol or fuel. That's a massive blow to any sized army. Those numbers are absolutely staggering. And when you're in an island nation like the UK, getting supplies to replace those losses aren't easy, especially with the, what they call them, the sea wolves in the Atlantic, bombing the merchant navy ships, trying to get supplies back to the UK and to the Allies. So the British government probably would have been sweating a bit. This is a crippling blow to the military and the national ego, and we can understand why Hitler felt pretty confident he was going to get the answer he wanted. The equipment losses too also means that the British military has to more or less rebuild its personnel and the equipment right from scratch. Where the Germans, on the other hand, have basically kicked the resistance force out of the country they're occupying, has wandered down to the beach and salvaged all the British weapons and equipment. So it's a win-win for the Germans. They've lost relatively few people kicking out the enemy. They've got this consolation prize of capturing all the British equipment and vehicles. I don't know if they could have used the ammunition and the guns. I'm not an expert. But the vehicles would have definitely come in handy, as well as the fuel. Everyone needs fuel, and you just got 165,000 tons of free fuel. Not to mention the artillery guns too. That's a very crippling blow. However, Hitler did have a few preconditions / demands before this invasion could go ahead. And it's these preconditions that really do prevent the invasion from really being a realistic possibility. He wanted air and naval superiority over the English Channel and the proposed landing sites. The British had the most powerful navy at the time and definitely were a very real threat to the German navy. The RAF too were no joke, even though the German Luftwaffe was more powerful during this time. Churchill had saved a bulk of the RAF planes and resources for the Battle of Britain, which is why he didn't commit that many during the evacuation of Dunkirk. And in hindsight, it wasn't the worst idea, and ultimately I think he's proven right in this. Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, which is a masterpiece of a film and one of the best war films ever made, explains the evacuation perfectly and why the RAF were hesitant to commit more pilots to the evacuation, even though they could have used them, was obviously to save them for the Battle of Britain. Unfortunately for Hitler, the German forces never really get to this level of superiority that he wants, hence his preconditions are never met. And to make things more interesting, Hitler and the High Command both had their doubts about the successfulness of Sea Lion, which doesn't say much for the proposed plan to begin with. But nonetheless, plans and preparations went ahead anyway. Or at least the Army and the Navy were preparing for Sea Lion. Troops were trained, vehicles were modified for the invasion, such as landing craft. Specialised weapons and equipment were developed, as well as the gathering of transport ships and river barges along the coastline. But maybe one of the most decisive preconditions was German air superiority. The Luftwaffe wasn't faring very well and had sustained very heavy losses during the Battle of Britain. The RAF hadn't been defeated quite like the German High Command and Hitler had hoped for. The RAF aren't going to be pushed around and proved to be a very formidable fighting force. So the Germans don't have the air superiority, which would have really pissed Hitler off and put a huge dent in his plans. Another factor that I think has been overlooked is I think there was a large amount of arrogance in Hitler's plan. Just because his army had shocked and swept through parts of Europe like a plague, having initial success doesn't mean Britain was going to be a pushover. The countries that had been invaded by the Nazis were all on the same continent. They were relatively close to Germany, as the crow flies, and they weren't as large as the UK, minus Poland and France. The United Kingdom was a different story altogether. There was a channel to cross, whether to account for a much larger country and landmass, and could resist and fight back in a much quicker fashion. It was also only the south of the country that had been proposed during Sea Lion. The British government did account for a southern invasion and had activated a civilian defence force, aka Dad's Army. It also had supply networks going up and down the country, as well as road networks, the ability to get reinforcements to the south pretty quickly, and home field advantage. As a result of this, Hitler indefinitely postponed Sea Lion on the 17th of September 1940. It's time for the book now. Let's take a look at what might have been and what might have occurred if Sea Lion had have gone ahead. Prologue. Probably nobody but a megalomaniac would have embarked deliberately upon a potential world war without formulating a clear military strategy. Yet that was what Adolf Hitler, the self-taught strategist, did in September 1939, when he ordered the German Wehrmacht to conquer Poland. So it is even now more remarkable that 9 months later, having overrun Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg and France, he had yet to settle upon a firm and prudent course of future action which might well have led the German, Italian, Japanese axis to world domination. On the 20th of May 1940, that France was on the eve of a collapse, a number of promising winning options were available to him. It is one of the great enigmas of 20th century history that he let slip marvellous opportunities. In this book, historians contemplate 10 options which were open to the Führer. They fall into two categories. In the first, Germany possesses the initiative, and in the second, the Allies adopt strategies which, had they been chosen at the time, would have forced new and undesirable options upon Hitler. Each option is written as if none of the other alternatives had taken place. In the first category, Kenneth Macksey considers what might have happened if Germany had invaded Britain in July 1940. Brian Perrett imagines the possible consequences in 1941 of Admiral Reeder's Mediterranean strategy. James Lucas indicates the possible course of events if Hitler had opted in August 1941 to concentrate on the capture of Moscow. Peter Tsaris forecasts the outcome of an immense Axis joint operation aimed at linking the German, Italian, and the Japanese spheres in 1942. Stephen Hallworth, writing from the post-war German point of view, investigates the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic if, along with improved collaboration by the Luftwaffe, the projected fast German U-boats had been introduced into service in 1942. John Gill considers the repercussions of the Allies receiving intelligence of German possession of an atomic bomb. Interesting. That one's a really interesting one. There's been a lot of speculation that Germany had developed or was very close to developing an atomic weapon around the same time the US had, and the scientists behind it were deliberately delaying it because they knew Hitler would have used it. Alfred Price ponders the effect of German jet fighters if, as a result of adjusted priorities, they had entered service in 1943. And Tim Clavert-Jones analyses what might have happened on the 6th of June 1944 in Normandy if Rommel had not been on leave and the German panzer divisions had been differently deployed and thrown into battle at once. That one sounds really interesting as well. Normandy has been written about and covered hundreds of times, and the strategy and tactics of the Normandy invasion have been gone over by historians pretty much since it happened. In the second category, General Sir William Jackson, an author of Official History of the War in the Middle East, and Mediterranean studies what might have happened if the Allies had adopted Winston Churchill's preferred strategy of attacking the soft underbelly of Europe in 1944. And Charles Messenger suggests what might have been the result if the entire Allied strategic bombing effort had have been concentrated without diversification upon creating 5 additional Hamburgs. Interesting. Each author was invited to use his imagination while keeping within the bounds of credibility and reality, and projecting ideas based on actual situations. People behave normally in character, the appearance of later technology is avoided. Each chapter is self-contained and takes no account of what happens in other chapters. The shattering possibilities which emerge are sensational indeed. Kenneth Macksey, 1995. Interesting. Chapter 1. Operation Sea Lion, Germany invades Britain, 1940. Kenneth Macksey. The decision. The expression in Adolf Hitler's penetrating eyes was one of exultation, as he regarded his commanders-in-chief and the top staff officers of Oberkommando der Weltmacht, the OKW. The time is 1900 hours, 21st of May, 1940. Less than 12 hours since Panzer Group von Kleist's exciting report on its arrival at the Abbeville on the English Channel coast, and only 11 days since the Wehrmacht had launched Operation Yellow against Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg and France. Do we swing north towards Dunkirk and envelop the Allied armies in Belgium and northern France, or south towards Paris and the heart of France? Asked General Walter von Brutschitz, however you pronounce his name. And then what about Britain? Inquired Admiral Erich Raeder, the Navy's Urbine chief. Do we isolate her and await a plea for peace, or do we invade? Or just bomb her into submission with the Luftwaffe? Ordered the glory-seeking Field Marshal Hermann Göring. As they debated several options, Hitler listened intensely to a few suggestions from General Wilhelm Kittel, OKW Chief of Staff, and General Adolf Jodl, the Chief of Operations. Then as Führer and Supreme Commander, he dramatically threw up his hands. Enough! He demanded, "My mind is made up. We will turn north and wipe out the enemy, including the British Army, before it can escape by sea. Then overrun the rest of France. But it is also my irrevocable intention to invade Britain no later than 15th of July, before she can recover from this disaster, a date which, quite by chance, was neatly to fit in the necessary tactical conditions of moonlight and high tides." I won't be reading the entire chapter. I'll be skipping over things. So if you want to get the full picture, you'll have to hunt down a copy of the Hitler options yourself. Otherwise I'll be reading this all fucking day. The staffs of the OKW and the Navy bent to the task of planning what later came to be called Operation Sea Lion, leaving the Army and Luftwaffe to concentrate on completing the current campaign while conserving all possible resources for the great invasion of England. Phase 1, the winning of aerial superiority by the Luftwaffe as an essential prerequisite of a combined air and seaborne assault on southern England. And we know that didn't pan out quite the way the Luftwaffe wanted it to. The RAF was much too stronger opposition for them to simply have the air superiority and wipe out the RAF defences. Phase 2, the seizing of a bridgehead concurrent with securing local naval supremacy in the Straits of Dover. That one too sounds like a bit of a challenge, as we know the British Navy was the best in the world at the time and would have been more than a match for Germany. The plan was also to have sea mines at the entry and exit points of the channel to make it even more difficult for the British Navy to come in and control the sea routes, but even so, in the planning, the British Navy was too strong. They simply had too many ships for a couple of sea mines to knock out the entire Navy. That's the one thing I think the British had the advantage of with most other nations is the size of the Navy. Going back to the evacuation of Dunkirk, there would have been some ships that were lost, but the Navy doesn't seem to lose too many ships in the evacuation. None on the scale that the Army lost equipment and vehicles. And there's a lot of civilian boats involved with the evacuation too, because they didn't have access to the ships or something like that, or there was only one dock to get big ships up against. Phase 3, an advanced inland with a view to destroying enemy forces and the outflanking and eventual encirclement of London. I think that one's probably easier said than done. You'd have to go through a hell of a lot of England and a hell of a lot of defences to try to encircle London, and I think that one is a bit ambitious even for Hitler. Already in Britain, the looming threat of invasion was recognised by the government under Prime Minister Winston Churchill and summarised by press and public as news from France worsened. Arrows on the war maps pointed towards the channel ports of Boulogne, or Boulogne, however it's pronounced, and Calais, which fell respectively on the 23rd and 26th of May. Dunkirk and Ostend, the latter being given up without a fight. On the 24th, the armoured panzer divisions of Panzer Group von Kleist were almost within sight of Dunkirk, convincing the British War Office that the Allied armies in Belgium and northern France, including their own British Expeditionary Force, were doomed. For that moment, the vital port of Dunkirk and its long beaches was virtually undefended, with the main Allied armies located in Belgium fighting the relentlessly advancing German Army Group B. The order was confirmed by Hitler, with Sea Line in mind, and exploited by Goering, who promised to prevent the Allied evacuation from Dunkirk. The Dunkirk defences held firm until the 4th of June, when the last of over 330,000 Allied troops were evacuated to England. But the cost of the British Army alone was enormous, and the Royal Air Force, in addition to its losses elsewhere, had lost 100 fighters and 85 pilots. Okay, that's interesting. That's something I got wrong before. There was a hell of a lot more pilots involved in Dunkirk than I had previously thought. 100 planes doesn't seem all that much considering how many army vehicles were left behind, but when they were trying to save them for the Battle of Britain, knowing that this big upcoming battle was on the horizon, that's a decent enough a number. I couldn't imagine it's that easy to replace planes compared to trucks or small boats or something like that. And 85 pilots too is a big number for any air force. I'd imagine most of the numbers in any type of military would probably favour the Army, then Navy, then Air Force, because the aptitude to be a pilot is so much harder than being a grunt on the ground. Not everyone can fly a plane. Indeed, on the 4th of June, there was an acute shortage of fighter pilots who were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Yeah, and that's kind of what I was alluding to. It takes a hell of a lot longer to train a pilot than it does a grunt. Meanwhile, in addition to its many losses off Norway, the Royal Navy had also lost 243 ships at Dunkirk, of which 6 were destroyed, plus 19 destroyers and numerous other vessels damaged. Also a hell of a lot more ships than I realised. 243 ships is a lot, considering how hard it is to build a ship, or how long it takes, given the size. That's something the movie doesn't do the best job of, is highlighting how many vehicles, ships and planes were destroyed. Because in the film, it's only the 2 pilots you really see, 2 or 3 pilots. Balance of forces. The Royal Navy had taken a pounding off of Norway, when the remaining forces were now withdrawn. And during the evacuation from France, between Iceland, East Coast and the South Coast ports, it had available on the 1st of July, including ships on convoy escort duties, 4 battleships, 2 battle cruisers, 13 cruisers and 80 destroyers, and 2 aircraft carriers. The remainder of the fleet was in the Mediterranean, squaring up to Italy. Against this formidable fleet, the Germans could assemble only 2 battle cruisers, 2 obsolete World War I battleships, 1 heavy, 3 light cruisers and half a dozen destroyers, plus a few fast torpedo boats, E-boats. But what the Germans lacked at sea against the Royal Navy, they hoped to compensate for with air power. Despite wastage over France, the highly experienced Luftwaffe expected by 30th of June to have hit for action some 700 single-engine Me-109 fighters, 250 twin-engine Me-110 fighters, I'm pretty sure ME is for Messerschmitt, 1,100 long-range HE-111s, Ju-88 and Do-17 medium bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, and 300 short-range Ju-87 dive bombers. They would be organised into 3 air fleets, of which Air Fleet 2, General Albert Kesselring, and Air Fleet 3, General Hugo Sperl, would bear the brunt of the attack, while Air Fleet 5, General R. Stumpf, would attack the northeast from Norway, and to lift the airborne forces in the assault and help maintain the army once ashore in England, there would be some 700 Tri-Monitor Ju-52s and a number of the big Ju-90 and Focke-Wulf Condor 4-engine transports, as well as 150 gliders. Focke-Wulf. Interesting name. I might have to use that as a DJ name. DJ Focke-Wulf. It's interesting. There's a lot of thought that has gone into how this might have gone, and I'm loving the attention to detail, the different types of planes and stuff, and going through all these little details and the dates. They've got this many planes, they're going to attack the southern coast, and when you think about it, to attack an entire southern coast of a country, you would need a hell of a lot of aircraft and ships to do that, not to mention the size of the army. Already this is shaping up to be a pretty sizable force. There's hundreds of planes, and so far this is the German superpower, is the air superiority. They've got a hell of a lot more planes than the British do. Opposing them would be a mere 600 of the RAF's good Spitfire and Hurricane fighters, backed up by a few squadrons of inferior two-seater Defiant fighters, the twin-engine Blenheim Night fighters. Of these, only some 200 Spitfires and Hurricanes and 36 Blenheims would be in number 11 group, AV Marshal Keith Park, tasked to defend southeast England and the Straits of Dover. True fighter production was picking up from 265 in April to 446 in June, but a mere 1,200 fighter pilots against an establishment of 1,450, with only 6 train replacements expected per day, was the gravest of shortages. Only in one respect, in that fact, did Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding's fighter command possess a clear advantage over the Luftwaffe. It happened to be fighting in its own airspace, with the benefit of a sophisticated radio command and control system, supplied by up to the minute information of aircraft positions pinpointed by radar. However, even this later crucial facility suffered from many technical limitations, such as a 300% factor of inaccuracy and a lack of low-level detection sets, which could not be delivered until August. There's quite a big difference between the German forces and the English. 600 good Spitfire and Hurricanes, up against about 1,000 in the Luftwaffe. That gives us some idea of what the British are up against. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of replacement planes coming. They can't find pilots quick enough to fill the planes. And it sounds like the RAF has a massive fucking problem on its hands. And the British superpower, the radar, doesn't sound like it's that effective. It has a 300% factor of inaccuracy, which doesn't sound like it's going to have much of an effect during the battle. Worst of all, however, was the British Army, which had manpower aplenty but was largely stripped of its weapons and ammunition, because they're still on a beach in France somewhere. Come July, it would muster no more than 760 field guns, 160 anti-tank guns, less than 200 modern medium and heavy tanks, and nearly 300 light tanks of the type, which had been slaughtered in France. And as we saw before, the equipment numbers left behind in Dunkirk were staggering. Basically all their tanks and artillery guns were left behind. That doesn't give me much confidence that the British are going to be able to defend against a numerically superior force, but one that is also better equipped and better armed. 760 field guns, it's not a fucking lot. 200 medium and heavy tanks, say 100 for each, against the German panzers. And if you know anything about World War II and German engineering, the German tanks were the best in the war. The German tanks were all named after big cats: Panzer, Panther, Leopard, and Tiger. Tiger being the most feared tank of World War II and my favourite tank. The Tiger 1, that thing was a fucking beast. One of the scariest war vehicles ever made, in my opinion. Mechanically, it might not have been the best. In terms of raw destructive power and the armour it had, it was pretty much unrivaled. The average Tiger tank was about 60 tons when you compare that to the much smaller and lighter American tanks, the Shermans. What were they? 30 tons or something? Back to the book. Small arms were also in short supply, as indeed was almost every other item of equipment, including suitable motor vehicles. Faced with these deficiencies, General Sir Edmund Ironside, cool last name, the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Forces, felt able only to adopt an linear defence strategy in the hope of holding off the enemy until the factories manufactured more weapons or winter weather intervened. The army, he told a disappointed Churchill, has not been trained to take the offensive. To create an offensive spirit suddenly, with no mobility, no armour and no training, is impossible. Ironside started construction on a succession of stop lines beginning at the coast and covering the main line of the defence, the GHQ line, which was sited to guard London, Bristol and the Midlands. It would be left to semi-mobile, partially armoured units to counterattack if the enemy gained a foothold. Things are not sounding too good for the Brits. That doesn't sound like much of a plan at all. It's definitely not much of a home defensive strategy either. British plans. It was guesswork where the enemy intended to land, for a paucity of information from air photography had to be added to the almost total elimination of the British contacts. Agents had been captured or neutralised. Enemy air superiority made daylight reconnaissance flights extremely hazardous, except for a handful of high-altitude Spitfire machines, which lacked the range to photograph North German ports, where the principal seaborne forces were expected to assemble. A cross-channel attempt was not overlooked, but rated less likely as long as Fighter Command was undefeated and the Navy dominated the Straits of Dover. So in other words, they're going in completely blind. They're having to guess where the Germans are most likely to attack. As we've seen with the invasion of Normandy and most other major military invasions or attacks, intelligence is the most valuable currency on a battlefield. Plans aren't just made overnight. Normandy took a year of planning and reconnaissance and all the behind-the-scenes work, planning out where anti-aircraft guns were, sending the paratroopers in to neutralise them before the amphibious assault could begin the next day. You can't just invade a country without knowing as much as you can about the target you're trying to hit. And this sounds like they're going in completely blind and they're having to play this guessing game. And there's very limited information coming out of France about what the Germans are up to or where they intend to attack. In consequence, Ironside positioned his best armed and trained formations, including the inexperienced 2nd Armoured Division with its 178 light tanks, in East Anglia and in the GHQ line. Though locating the partially battle-experienced 1st Armoured Division with its mixture of 70 medium and 82 heavy tanks south to London. Thus he unwillingly played into German hands, for it was upon Kent that the blow would fall, since there alone could adequate fighter cover be provided, and it would fall on the sector which Lieutenant General Andrew Thorne's 12th Corps defended with the so-called Mobile 1st London Division. As derisory as its artillery arm, which consisted of only 34 field guns of various calibers and 12 assorted pieces with the speculative anti-tank capability. Rightly, the division's commander, Major General C.F. Lardet, called his resources ludicrous, I think that's an understatement. You can't really hold off a German invasion army with 34 guns, 34 field guns, and 12 random assorted, what we assume are artillery pieces. Interesting. So things aren't looking very good for the British defence. They're outnumbered, under-resourced, and very under-equipped. German plans. General Thorn might well have considered the situation hopeless had he been aware of the plan adopted by the Germans. It was General von Rundstedt's intention, once a measure of air superiority had been won, to employ the 7th Parachute Division and 22nd Air Landing Division to seize an airhead on the open ground between Dover and Hythe, as a preliminary to amphibious landings by 6th Mountain Division to the west of Dover, and the 17th Infantry Division between Folkestone and Hythe. 9th Panzer Division would be brought on ashore on Este +1, directed without delay at Canterbury, with a view to disrupting British counterstrokes. Thus schemed the German army, whose Commander-in-Chief von Bruchetz, however you pronounce his name, regarded the Channel assault as little more than an upscaled river crossing operation. A little arrogant, I say. With this optimism, however, Admiral Raeder was in disagreement. To him, even if the essential prerequisite achievement of air superiority was achieved, the operation was fraught with peril. Addressing Hitler, he pointed out, the British fleet, despite its recent heavy losses, is by no means diminished, whereas we have suffered disproportionate losses, including damage to their 2 main battle cruisers, Scharnhorst and Genesee, however the fuck you pronounce those words. Of course, by good fortune, we might obtain possession of substantial lodgements on the south coast, but sustaining them could be another matter. We might even manage to sweep enemy minefields and lay our own defensive barrages, but we have only 30 U-boats, and as for landing craft, well, it would be a miracle of organisation and training to have enough ready in time. Commodore Friedrich Rugge, who contended that although navigating flotillas of improvised, unequally matched landing craft through sandbanks and minefields in difficult tidal conditions would probably create what he called Formation Pigpile, he was strongly backed by Hermann Göring, who boasted, "Leave it to my Luftwaffe, we'll start preliminary operations now. By Eagle Day on 8th of July, we'll be ready to smash the RAF. All I want then is 4 or 5 days of good weather, then just let my dive bombers get all the Royal Navy." As we know by now, this is historically not how things turned out. Sensing a little overconfidence, a little arrogance here, overestimation of their own abilities. It also sounds like the weather plays a large part in this. If you get some pretty shitty weather, which England is known to get, that would put the Luftwaffe in harm's way and could prevent or delay the invasion. They're also underestimating the RAF, and what's one of the rules of war? You never underestimate your enemy. The air battle, first phase. General Kesselring began probing the British air defences on 5th of June, after the Battle of Dunkirk, and as the final drive against France begun. From those few airfields then at his disposal, he sent over high-level reconnaissance missions by Dornier DO-17Ps and night bombers whose activities gradually accustomed the populace to the throb of unsynchronized engines, the bark of guns and the occasional rushing whistle and crump of bombs. Tension in the island mounted, partly due to spy mania and a plethora of usually unsubstantiated reports of clandestine behaviour, but also due to trigger-happy soldiers or members of the newly formed Local Defence Volunteers, the LDV, who mounted guard on cliff tops and vital points, and whose score of innocent shot was sometimes 3 per night. Interesting, that's something I didn't think of. Very detailed that he's accounted for that. The local militias, essentially. Local defence forces being a bit too gun-ho, shooting someone that's walking a dog at night. One thing I might contradict is you'd think if these areas were basically the first in line to be invaded by the Germans, you'd think that the civilian populace would move out like you'd see in any type of modern war situation. We've seen this in Ukraine and in Gaza. And maybe the Brits needed to put a bit more training and resources into the home defence forces, because that sounds like a lot of their extra personnel and manpower is going to come from more or less a civilian army. Between the 15th and 18th of June, 13 airfields, 16 factories and 14 ports suffered minor damage. Satisfyingly, 11 bombers were shot down, thus the German strategy was revealed as evidence accumulated of their possession of an electronic blind bombing aid. At the same time, the Germans became aware of the extent of British radar coverage and the sophisticated system of radio control of fighters whenever they ventured across the channel, especially by day. So as the British superpower, the radar, coming back to hinder them, despite its lack of accuracy. As more airfields were made operational and the Luftwaffe's logistics improved, Kesselring stepped up pressure. On the 19th, he launched the first of many dive bomber attacks on convoys passing through the Straits of Dover, with the intention of bringing on an advantageous fighter confrontation of attrition. For Kesselring correctly surmised that many RAF squadrons had yet to recover from the fighting in France, and that his opponent, Air Marshal Dowdin, was bent on conserving his precious fighters against the day when the Luftwaffe must open a major attempt to win air superiority. I'd say you could probably spare a few, because if they're taking out convoys and roads and infrastructure, that could have a lasting effect down the track. You want to be playing the long game, not the short game. If you can't get supplies to these home defence forces and the troops in the south pushing back the invasion, then the Germans are definitely going to overrun the area pretty much unopposed. So I'd say sacrificing a few fighters to prevent the bombing of convoys is probably worth it. If you shoot down enough of them, maybe Kesselring reconsiders his tactics and strategy. It also projects a bit more of a defiant status from the RAFs, saying they're not going to let the Germans just bomb whatever they like unopposed. Also sounds like they could probably use with some anti-aircraft guns in those areas to take out these bombers. I know there is a shortage of field guns, but take some off of a ship, put them on a truck or a train or something and get them down to those areas. Because it sounds like if you're not going to hinder them enough, then invading is going to be a hell of a lot easier for the Germans. You want to push them back and make them pay for every fucking inch they take. For the next 10 days, the General Spreels, Air Fleet 3 was released from support of the army and began to join the attacks on convoys and ports. Kesselring's and Air Marshal Park's fighters spared with ever-increasing ferocity. When number 11 group's losses mounted unexpectedly and more ships, including priceless destroyers, were sunk, Dowdin asked for the convoys to be stopped, but Churchill vetoed this on the grounds that it was bending to the enemy's will. Yeah, and I'll have to agree with Churchill. You can't stop the supplies, you can't leave these people without anything to fight back. In fact, I don't know if it's good military strategy or not, but I'd think you'd probably want to get more troops into that area, more guns at least. And it sounds like most of the resources should be going into stopping the RAF, because the German Navy doesn't seem to be... I mean, they're doing damage, but they're not the biggest threat. The biggest threat right at the moment is the Luftwaffe. And if you can destroy that, like in reality, one of the biggest reasons for calling Sea Lion off was the lack of German air superiority. They underestimated the RAF. The RAF fought back harder than what the Germans expected, and they suffered more losses than they were expecting. If you could do the same thing here, I think it might have slowed the Germans down a bit more. It might have even reconsidered them to abandon some of the invasion and focus on other areas. But he relented on the 29th of June, when 2 destroyers were sunk, one in Dover Harbour, several ships damaged and 15 RAF fighters lost, against 15 German bombers, a seaplane, mine layer and 9 fighters. General Hans Jesnik, the Luftwaffe's Chief of Staff, conferred with Sperrel and Kesselring at the latest command post overlooking a deserted Straits of Dover on the 30th of June. It's not very good for the British defence. Rising to a new peak on the eve of Eagle Day, now fixed for the 9th, when radar installations would receive the full weight of Luftwaffe attention. The pre-Eagle Day phase was to prove extremely costly to the RAF. Between the 5th and 7th, when Luftwaffe losses were an affordable 95 fighters, the RAF lost almost 200 aircraft, including 73 fighters, far exceeding replacement rates. In part, this was because Dowding attempted to conserve fighters by committing them in Paris of squadrons, and thus at a penile inferiority of numbers. Interesting. What I take away from that is you have to put all your cards on the table sometimes. You don't get the reward without some type of risk. And why didn't they pull the fighters back from Paris if they needed them for the defence of Britain? Maybe they should have recalled whatever forces were still in Paris. Eagle Days 2. Come the night of the 8th, after a full assault on 4 radar stations and certain forward airfields, fighter command was nearly at full stretch. With 3 radar stations temporarily out of action, its command and control system were deprived of vital information. Interceptions were patchy, with several Germans' formations roaming unchecked. Nevertheless, damage was relatively light due to the bombers' too frequent bombing, only secondary targets, and suffering heavy losses. The 11th, however, was to prove climactic and decisive. That day, when No. 11 Group was unable to put 200 fighters in the air, neighbouring groups were also heavily engaged. In the evening, a maximum Luftwaffe effort directed at the key inland sector stations of Middle Wallop, Biggin Hill and Kenley inflicted losses the RAF could not match or longer sustain. That day, along with 15 bombers, 47 fighters were lost, with 28 pilots killed or wounded. True, the Luftwaffe lost 54 bombers but only 36 fighters, of which only 9 were Me-109s and 12 pilots. As the air battle resounded overhead and Dover and Folkestone were pounded by long-range heavy artillery, motley flotillas of German invasion craft were observed in daylight by the British entering the Straits. Initially, these movements were interpreted by intelligence as normal coastal traffic, bounded for Spain. But eventually they were evaluated in their true significance. On the 12th, when the RAF lost 26 fighters and 18 pilots, and its airfields again were battered, with 70 machines destroyed on the ground, the Chiefs of Staff warned Churchill that invasion was imminent. Nightly bombardments of the invasion ports from sea and air now begun. If you've seen any of the pictures of the planning of Sea Lion, the Germans were making these smaller version of a landing craft. The landing craft were these modified looking ferry things, and taking barges to make a floating bridge, like a pontoon bridge. And I'm guessing that's what he's talking about when he's referring to a motley flotilla. Also sounds like the ground invasion is about to begin. Also on the 12th, however, the Luftwaffe lost 31 bombers and 29 fighters with 20 pilots, causing Kesselring to request a 24-hour postponement of S-Day, because the RAF was insufficiently subdued. Even in a hypothetical scenario, the RAF are still defiant and taking it to the Germans. He was also backed by Goring, who pointed out that the weather forecast for the 13th was marginal, with cloud and winds, which might scatter the airborne forces. It was to everybody's relief, except the soldiers and sailors under bombardment in port, when Hitler agreed to the postponement until the 14th, subject to favourable weather. In fact, the weather report on the 13th was better than expected, allowing the Luftwaffe to launch another maximum effort, in addition to aerial mine laying on the flanks of the channels to the invasion beaches. Kesselring's formations filled coastal airspace with a view to cleansing it of hostile fighters. Meanwhile, Sperrel's Air Fleet 5 concentrated on Plymouth and Portsmouth. The ground invasion is drawing closer and we're getting down to the business end pretty quickly, provided the weather holds. What the British really need now is a storm or some type of catastrophic weather event to just sweep through the area and take out the naval and air landing. Hitler gave the word, let tomorrow be S-Day, and then he boarded his special train bound for Calais, where he intended to watch events in person. Well, that's pretty fucking bold. Good chance to assassinate the prick right there. Kesselring had launched more attacks on coastal airfields and radar stations, and succeeded in driving back the weary RAF squadrons to their inner bases. That afternoon, as the German long-range guns begun a programmed bombardment of batteries guarding the straits, the Luftwaffe struck hard at targets, railway stations and roads at the southeast of England, which within 40 minutes were badly disrupted. Caught on the hop, Fighter Command engaged at a disadvantage but raised the day's price for the Luftwaffe to 31 fighters and 30 bombers. But the RAF lost 65 fighters and 34 bombers, a blow from which it never recovered. It sounds like the RAF probably should have saved the fighters for maybe the last ditch resistance at the Germans, because they always seem to come up short. They take out a number of German fighters and bombers, but it doesn't really seem to cause enough damage or inflict the necessary losses to slow them down by much. But having said that, if the British didn't put up a fight and just push back to the centre of the country, let them invade and get comfortable, then attack them later on, that might have been a more conservative way to use the resources. Let's not forget the British still have home field advantage. They know the terrain, the roads, and all the areas better than the Germans do. You could put the resources into sabotaging or booby-trapping their projected routes, start blocking channels and booby-trapping the roads and the train stations and stuff like that. It is fun to hypothesize, I must say. I do enjoy a what-if scenario and coming up with ideas. What if this happened? What if that happened? What if he did this? It's fun. At 1720 hours, the British Chief of Staff agreed that full precautions must be taken for immediate action. Here and there confusion reigned, because some LDV commanders ordered the ringing of church bells to announce parachutists had landed. But inland there was an uneasy anticlimax, accompanied by the drone of British and German bombers, and of both sides of the channel a rising fury of gunfire. Already minesweepers were opening channels for the jostling flotillas to the beaches west of Dover. Of opposition there was little as they approached an enemy coast lit by the flames of war. So things really aren't going well for the Brits. There's no defences to speak of, and it sounds like the Germans are just going to land on the beaches and pretty much take a leisurely walk up and down the coast, pretty much unopposed. Waves of strafing German fighters and bombers now roared across the open ground between the citadel of Hythe, intimidating opposition to the low-flying stream of lumbering Ju-52s as they dropped their cargoes of parachutists within 30 minutes of touchdown. The commander of the 19th Parachute Regiment to the east of Folkestone was triumphantly signalling that the ground was clear. And when you look at the losses the RAF had sustained up until now, it may have been wise to keep several hundred planes in reserve for this moment. But at the same time, it sounds like the Luftwaffe have been pretty dominant. And going back to Hitler's preconditions, if this had have happened in reality, it does really make you wonder, would Hitler have still put the plan into place? Would he have launched Sea Lion if the Luftwaffe was pushing back the RAF and did have air superiority, even though all the experts did agree that it was not the best plan to begin with? Because it seems like the weakened RAF is the biggest factor to allowing the Germans making such bold pushes into the country. If the RAA was stronger and had more resources, stands to reason they probably could have pushed them back and delayed the invasion or inflicted a lot more casualties on the Germans to get them to push back across the channel. 20th Parachute Regiment, meanwhile to the north of Hythe, temporarily had its hands full with troops of the 1st London Division. Craft carrying 141st Mountain Regiment to the foot of the Shakespeare Cliff came under intense fire from harbour guns and infantry small arms as they disembarked in shambolic order. While the cross-channel guns continued their pummelling, the old battleship Schlesien and Schleswig-Holstein came off worst against the as yet unsubdued 9.2-inch guns of the Citadel. Close support was quite inadequate from escorting German destroyers, TS and R boats because of distinctive harassment by 5 MTBs racing out of the harbour to attack with torpedoes and cannons. A massacre on the beaches followed by Schroringer's total abandonment of this attempt was the outcome. It's interesting, they are getting some pushback. It does sound like this area, the Germans are getting their asses kicked, well, having enough pressure put on them. It's making the landing pretty hard by the sound of it. So much so that Schrauner's plans have to be more or less abandoned. It does seem like the channel is where most of the resistance to the German invasion is coming from. Within 3 hours, the initial foothold was expanded into a defensible bridgehead in conjunction with 19th Parachute Regiment, which seized the citadel by assault from the rear. Meanwhile, General Herbert Locke's 17th Infantry Division was struggling ashore between Sandgate and Hythe against little initial opposition from an enemy who was subdued by fire from the cross-channel guns and escort vessels. Once ashore, however, seasick men flopped behind the promenade as small arms fire opened up against them. Interesting. That was a big factor in the Normandy landings as well. The US Navy put on a massive breakfast. Seas were a bit rougher than anticipated, which caused a lot of nausea among troops. Anyone who's ever had nausea know how debilitating it is, which I think is probably most people in the world. And even more so, nauseated troops trying to make their way out of a landing craft while under fire isn't a very good recipe. I heard a story about one soldier. All of his friends were eating this huge big breakfast, and rightfully so, it could be your last. But they were all sick and vomiting their guts up in the landing craft and completely combat ineffective, where he only had 2 Mars bars, took his heavy backpack off and got out the landing craft as quickly as possible and ran his way up the beach, and he ended up surviving when a lot of guys around him were so incapacitated from the nausea. Struggle for the beachhead. Now began a classic build-up race as Generals Thorn and Laerdet strove to contain the German penetration, in the hope that the Germans might be isolated by warships and bombers, as the Navy and RAF did all in its power to intervene in the face of a pervasive Luftwaffe presence. And as the Germans poured in a flow of troops, heavy weapons, ammunition and supplies by air and sea regardless of losses, which in fact were by no means exorbitant. Indeed, there was only one short curtailment of shipments when later in the day the approach of 2 cruisers and 16 destroyers from the Nor and 8 destroyers from Portsmouth was observed, a threat which attracted heavy daylight bombing by the Luftwaffe and attacks by U-boats and S-boats and mine-infested waters. This culminated in a night of action with heavy losses to both sides, followed by a temporary withdrawal of the Royal Navy, which was under no illusion about the fact that a seriously weakened fighter command could not guarantee adequate protection by day. Upon learning that Folkestone and Dover had fallen, General Ironside conceded defeat at the coast, and in accordance with the agreed plan ordered withdrawal to a GHQ line, but this was vetoed by Churchill, who had never liked the part of the plan, and insisted upon 1st Armoured Division counter-attacking immediately to destroy the enemy. Interesting. Maybe a better course of action would have been to pull all the British forces back to London and the central areas of the country. Maybe see if you can encircle the Germans or cut their retreat off from the channels, get rid of the mines, then come up from behind them and pummel them. Probably easier said than done, given they don't seem to have much of air force anymore. Because it sounds like you want to save the bulk of your defence forces. Because this has happened in battles all throughout history. A massive invasion force has got a pretty easy and early foothold into a country, only to lose a lot of ground later on and end up retreating when the occupied country rallies its forces and counterattacks. Even though the Germans have invaded and set up shop, doesn't mean they're necessarily going to hold the area forever. Once the Brits sort out the defences and get reinforcements, you could push back the foreign invader, much like Ukraine has done with Russia. Even Russia invaded pretty aggressively and quickly, and 2 years later they've been pushed out only to have the Russians come back and then to push them out and to come back, and this tug-of-war situation ensues. Sounds like a similar set of circumstances here. Naval and air confrontations. Without any other realistic option, and despite fading air protection, the Royal Navy's cruisers and destroyers tried once more on the 15th to enter the Straits. Those from the Nore at first made encouraging progress by sinking a number of light craft and driving back the escorts. Similarly, the Portsmouth destroyers suffered more losses and also held back, so that having experienced nearly all their 250 pound per gun, they merely blockaded the Straits until forced to return to the port for a replenishment. This left the Germans free to resume shipment and bring the reinforcements, which at Dover early on the 15th included the tanks of the 9th Panzer Division. Yet strangely enough, the mood at OKW was by no means calm and assured. News of the debacle below disturbed Hitler, and Raider Brustitz kept cool as Göring procrastinated under pressure. Despite encouraging reports from Kesselring, who on the evening of the 15th found himself in possession of priceless information, nothing less than a captured diagram showing Fighter Command's signal system, which relayed the key command and control role played by the sector stations. So it sounds like the British superpower, the radar and their radio systems, has now been made public to the Germans, which is not fucking good. Sounds like the British Navy is giving them a run for their money as well, and seems to be where a bulk of the British superiority is coming from, now that the RAF has been taken out of the equation. For the 15th, therefore, Kesselring, at the expense of support for the Navy and Army, concentrated on the bombing of those airfields, with devastating effect. At the end of a shattering day's fighting, Dowding was compelled to tell numbers 10 and 12 groups that Park's number 11 group was virtually crippled, and that henceforth they must concentrate on the Battle of the Straits to the abandonment of all their tasks. In effect, the Luftwaffe had a last one air superiority, as Kesselring and Sperrel sensed from the combat reports that evening. So interesting, the Germans have caught on that they need to focus their energy in repelling the British Navy. But what about the tanks? What about those, was it 200 light and medium British tanks? How are they going to fare against the dreaded Panzers? Clash of armour. General Thorne ordered General Roger Evans to launch 1st Armoured Division's attack as soon as possible on the 15th, which meant a night move on tracks since the preferred transport by rail to assembly areas was unavailable. Southern railways being in chaos due to the bombing. Evans conceived simultaneous thrust by his tank brigades, 3rd Armoured Brigade with 70 fast cruisers and a few light tanks to strike at Dover from Canterbury, and 1st Tank Brigade with 82 of the slow, heavy Matildas to go for Hythe and Folkestone. 1st London Division and 20th Armoured Brigade, with its assortment of light tanks, armoured cars and lorries, would have to give what support it could to the tank brigades. The night move was hampered by refugees blocking the roads. Delays forced Evans to abandon a simultaneous attack. That hasn't been mentioned a hell of a lot is the civilian and the human cost of this invasion. I'd imagine there would be nobody, well, very few people living in the south, which would mean there'd be a massive influx of refugees making its way to London and up north. That's millions of people who are now displaced, homeless and hungry, which causes another problem for the British government. Starting 3 hours later, 1st Tank Brigade also enjoyed moments of hope. Its right flank regimented actually came within sight of Hythe Beach before being forced to retire due to losses in close-range street fighting. 1st Armoured Division rallied that night. It was to discover it had lost nearly 50% of its strength from enemy action to mechanical failures. News of this setback, coinciding with Dowding's report of the enfeeblement of number 11 group, struck Ironside and the government a chilling blow. So basically, all hope is lost at this point. They get little glimpses of hope, as he just mentioned, but then it's taken away. and the reality that you've lost 50% of your force and there's not a lot you can really do. So in other words, this is a worst case scenario. You're putting all these resources into action, you're making little dents here and there, you might win a battle, but ultimately the cost of that victory is so devastating, and then the Germans hit back, take out 50% of the force, but ultimately they can't really do much to change the outcome of what's about to happen. With air cover reduced and the only really effective armoured reserve stripped away, retreat to the GHQ line was unavoidable. At that moment, Churchill realised that regardless of cost, the Navy must throw every vessel, including its battleships, into the fight for the Straits if there was to be the slightest chance of undermining the now all but secure German beachhead. So this is the last-ditch attempt. They're trying to recall ships from other areas and make one final decisive naval push to try to deal enough damage to the Germans. It's basically all or nothing. All your eggs are in one basket, all your cards are on the table, and this is it. This is pretty much the worst possible outcome in terms of military strategy. Fleet action, the Battle of Dover Straits. Admiral Sir Charles Forbes, Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet, was at sea off of Humber when he received Admiralty orders to enter the Straits no later than midday the 16th. At the same time, Dowding was told to give maximum fighter cover, and Bomber Command instructed to concentrate on ports including enemy-occupied Dover and Folkestone. They were spread too thin over the Straits, and this made Bomber Command's and the Fleet Air Arms contribution almost suicidal. Meanwhile, radar briefed about British movements by German intelligence, which had long ago broken British naval codes, as well as informed by air reconnaissance, already had ordered the squadron under Admiral Marshall to cruise off Trescheling, however that's pronounced, tasked to intercept a British fleet. So I was wrong about the radar, it was actually British naval codes, which I think is much worse. So now the Germans have a pretty good idea of what the British are going to do. And this is basically all or nothing now, and the Germans have just been alerted to it. The German squadron comprised the battle cruisers Schornburst and Chuyu, however the fuck that's pronounced, 1 heavy and 3 light cruisers, and only 6 destroyers, plus a few escort vessels, U-boats and S-boats. On its own, it was hardly the force to tackle Forbes. Marshall aimed to intercept as far as possible from the North Foreland and hoped for a measure of surprise, but almost at once his move was reported by a shadowing British submarine. Forbes had now run the gauntlet of almost ceaseless dive and high-level bombing, clashes which cost both air forces dear and, for the time being, diverted German air effort from the land battle and its attacks on the airfields. By now the Luftwaffe had the whip hand and could afford losses more than the RAF. Lacking room for evasive action in the gap, Forbes' big ships were repeatedly hit by bombs and had the battleship Rodney crippled by 2 mines. When the last Forbes reached open waters, it was joined by a Vanguard which was in some disorder and already reporting ammunition shortage. Another of his cruisers followed shortly by 2 more destroyers, struck mines late the night before. Losses mounted when Forbes ruthlessly urged his cruisers to destroy and sink vessels they could at the sea and the port. By dusk, Forbes had only partially achieved his aim at a very high price, which rose further during the none-too-effectual night bombardments of Ostend and Dunkirk. The British Navy sounds like it's not going to go down without a fight, and they're inflicting some damage, enough that they've only really got the 1 decent cruiser left. But will it be enough? It very much sounds like the British Navy is the last hope of England, and it's all or nothing at this point. The battle is going to be won at sea. In desperation, Forbes now sought a knockout blow at first light on the 17th. Steering the fleet through channels, swept that night to overwhelm Marshall. The minesweepers delayed and tackled the S-boats and aircraft, and shot at by coastal guns were unable to complete their task in time, thus checking Forbes' advance and condemning the swordfishers to a disastrous attack on an undistracted enemy while protected by fighters. But when Marshall stayed within range of the British big guns, he had I'm just going to call it G finally put down, and the heavy cruiser Hipper crippled. However, he had compensation when the battlecruiser Renown blew up after being penetrated by successive hits from Schwanborst. The disaster, along with almost non-stop air attacks, persuaded Forbes to retreat. Reinforcement of the German forces ashore continued. This news told the British government that Hitler had won. Vehemently, Churchill denied it. So all hope is lost. The Germans have won and the British have been defeated. I wouldn't expect Churchill to take that news very well. Victory advance on London. With apparent air superiority and the noticeable failure of further attempts by the Royal Navy to enter the Straits, even radar was convinced of a German victory. By morning of the 18th, another Panzer Division, General Erwin Rommel's 7th, was almost completely ashore and reserves of fuel, ammo and supplies adequate. In other words, the Brits are fucked. It was agreeable to meet von Brust's demand for more infantry divisions. With these, he intended to mount a wide-fronted assault on the GHQ line, which had now been identified. In the event, however, on the 18th, the line was broken through quite easily. This jolt turned into a British disaster when 9th Panzer Division and 22nd Air Landing Division encountered and slaughtered the feeble light tanks of the 2nd Armoured Division in the vicinity of Sevenoaks. As of that moment, apart from a few tanks from the defeated 1st and 2nd Armoured Divisions, the British were deprived of the mobile force which might save them. Hitler and his entourage celebrated in the certainty of another triumph and the opening up of unlimited mastery of the future. This was shown within the next 3 days as the encirclement of London neared completion, as the RAF, deprived of a large portion of its early warning system and fighter stations, diminished, and the Royal Navy abandoned its attempts to dominate the Straits and begun what would develop into a major redeployment overseas. Remorselessly, the Germans poured in troops to overrun the country. Inevitably, resistance crumbled because of people disarmed and lacking outside support. Is a nation defeated? Inevitably, Churchill was forced to resign to make room for others willing to negotiate an armistice. Not a good end for the Brits. That sounds like a truly horrific situation, and thank God that never happened. I still think the British people would have put up a fight even if they didn't quite have the access to guns that the Americans do. I still like to think that they would have found a way to fight and resist, because it's not like the Germans were just fighting Britain. I know the US wasn't involved in the war at this time, but they still had the Russians to deal with and French resistance. There was still a lot of pushback from other countries as well, such as Poland, Scotland, and places like that. So it's not like they just had one country to invade. They were occupying 2 countries at this point. That's a big logistical challenge for any country, especially one the size of Germany. Just getting supplies to the troops would be a major challenge, let alone equipment and ammunition. If there were gaps or delays in the supply chain and the English managed to put together a resistance movement and started a guerrilla warfare campaign, that could do a fair bit of damage. Take out a couple of German units here and there, take their weapons and ammo and turn them against the occupiers. Debacle, amnesty, and future prospects. Yet Hitler fooled himself if at the moment he believed the British would cease resistance entirely. Even after the armistice was signed, they would continue a flattering struggle at home and an increasingly aggressive one from abroad as they sought allies, America in particular. But his ambition of world domination was now mightily stimulated. With extinction of the rational dread of a war on 2 fronts, he could turn in against Russia in 1941 and at the same time pursue Operation Sphinx, Admiral Reeder's maritime strategic plan to control the Mediterranean. Subsequently, no doubt, would come some sort of confrontation with America. At the beginning of August, indeed, Hitler's fertile imagination envisioned horizons of immense brilliance for the future. End of chapter. There's some notes at the end of the chapter, one being, in reality, to readers' relief, Hitler rejected the invasion, believing that Britain would make peace. And 2, the sequence of air action and losses incurred is based on the opening stages of the real Battle of Britain. So that's how they rationalised the RAF losses. So very interesting. I still think the Germans would have been pummeled by the Russians eventually, even though it took them a while to really push back against the Germans. The Russians had millions of troops. The Soviet Union was huge, so they had enough countries to pull resources from. And like you said at the end, help from allies, America and Canada, Australia and Canada obviously being Commonwealth countries, would probably go help the motherland in some capacity, even though Australia had the Japanese to worry about and were stationed in the Middle East under the behest of the British government before being recalled by Prime Minister Curtin to defend the homeland. Having America come into the war would have probably been the decisive factor in hampering the German war effort. I dare say the Americans would have been able to get large amounts of supplies to the Brits pretty quickly. They had more than enough troops to fight the Pacific theatre as well as the European one. So it's very interesting to think about how things might have turned out. If Sea Lion had gone ahead and the Germans had have invaded Britain, what would that have meant for the overall outcome of World War II? Would Germany have won, or would the Allies still beat them back even if they did occupy Britain? I still think the Allies would have won. America would have come into the war. Commonwealth countries would have helped. India was a Commonwealth country at that time, I'm pretty sure. They had hundreds of thousands of troops too. There's enough British colonies around the world that could have answered the call to help. In my opinion, I think resistance would have come. It might have taken a couple of months, especially if help was coming from Commonwealth countries spread out around the globe. It might have taken 6 months to a year to organise any type of supply chain or meaningful resistance, but I think it would have happened eventually. And that concludes Chapter 1, Operation Sea Lion by Kenneth Macksey, from the Hitler Options, Alternative Decisions of World War II. And that brings us to the end of the show. A big thank you to everyone who listened to the end. Don't forget, The Lie Has Begun. The Lie of Communism, Chapters 1 and 2 are out now wherever you get your podcasts from. Give them a listen and a 5-star review if you haven't already. Alright, if you'd like to support the Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. Head on over to the Facebook and Instagram page, give them a follow and a like. Be sure to check out the new Truth Tank link tree. That's on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. It might be on a couple of the pod players as well. You can find all the links and where to listen to the Truth Tank in one convenient location. You can download and listen to your favourite episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Castbox, iHeartRadio, Pandora, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. To your friends, to your family, tell anyone you think might like the show. Help spread it around and get the Truth Tank out there. The merch store is coming very soon if it's not out already. So you can support the Truth Tank by getting yourself some wearable truth and representing the truth in all of its forms. And I'll be back in the next couple of weeks with a brand new show. But until then, I'm the Tank. This is the truth. Truth to tell.